I talk about you as a company being intrinsically linked to Bitcoin. We've got to get into there's one really difficult area of this interview with some tough questions, which I think you know what's going to be about. So I want to talk a little bit about privacy. And I had Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss on the podcast recently. I talked to them, and I'll just ask you the same question: like, what is your personal views on privacy?
Just in general?
Yeah, just in general. It's a leading question, but in general.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I would prefer that we live in a world where everybody has way more privacy. I think it's kind of an unfortunate system that we have where, there's very little financial privacy in the world, right? People, you're swiping your credit card, the actual number ends up in these databases all over the internet. Um, you know, I think that it's kind of unethical, actually, that these records can be subpoenaed from companies. Like companies are essentially have been like deputized as arms of law enforcement to spy on their customers, and we have these obligations in financial services to kind of report on all the things that are happening. And I understand the history of it, right? It's like, I think as far as I know, it kind of started with like the war on drugs, and then with terrorism, it kind of escalated and things like that. And so, look, whenever something bad happens, people have this natural response. They're like, well, we have to do something about it. How are we going to? And so the theory behind these laws, anti-money laundering laws and things, makes sense to me. It's like, if it's harder to profit from crime, there will be less crime. Well, the data out there doesn't necessarily indicate that it's been a success. Like there's been reports by the World Bank and others that look at those laws, and they've kind of said, okay, of all the illicit activity happening in the world, what percentage of it is captured or frozen by these AML laws? And the data that I've seen is that it's about 1% or something, maybe 1 to 2%. And at what cost? Not like enormous cost to these financial institutions, but the bigger cost is probably in the barriers to innovation that happen, right? Because it just makes it that much harder for a new startup to be created and everything like that. So I'm definitely kind of like a libertarian at heart. Like I believe that you should be able to do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting other people. And if you do hurt other people, well, there's a court system to kind of help go solve that. But that's not the prevailing view in the world. So we certainly try to operate. We've tried to work proactively with regulators, and even if every law or regulation out there isn't perfect and has some unintended consequences, they do some good, and we have to follow the law to kind of stay in business. So we try to work with them.
What do people not understand about the relationship that you have with regulators? Like, has it been an ongoing, constant relationship? Are they always on the phone to you? Are you always calling them? Are you essentially having to fight on behalf of Bitcoin with the regulators? How does that all work in the background?
Yeah. So from the very early days of Coinbase, you mentioned, I think, another one of the exchanges where people were trying to run it out of their personal bank account. That was surprisingly common back then. The problem with that is the minute you get over a certain amount of volume, they're going to come investigate and shut it down, right? So I realized early on, if we're going to have any chance of becoming a big company, a sustainable company, we got to be proactive and tell them what we're doing, and we've got to be an educational resource to them. So there's this amazing thing that happens, right? Like if they read about, hey, there's some Bitcoin company doing X, they're immediately skeptical. Like especially in the early days, now it's better. But if you show up in person and you appear relatively normal and they can tell you're a good person, like it's just like you and I doing this podcast, right? It's like it helps build a relationship. So with regulators and in business and everything, relationships matter. And so we tried to just show up a lot in the early days. We would suit up and go to these meetings, meet with the state money transmitter licenses, the FinCEN, and like CFTC and SEC and everything. And over the years, we ended up getting a lot of those licenses. and so we still do that to this very day. Somebody on the team at Coinbase every week is interacting with NYDFS, SEC, CFTC. We have 50 money transmitter licenses in the US, so every quarter we get a handful of them that come audit us. And that's just the United States. We have equivalent kind of regulators in the UK with the FCA. We have in Singapore, the MAS. We have a bunch in Europe. So, the regulatory burden on the company is actually pretty high. I would say about, I think it's like 35% or so of the company is working in some form of legal and compliance. So it's incredibly expensive. And yes, we do a lot of educational resource work with them to kind of get them comfortable with how this is being used, and there's a ton of detail there.
Have there been any times during this kind of development of Coinbase and growth of Coinbase when you've been working with the regulators, you've ever felt like, shit, they might actually try and ban this?
Let's see. I mean, there's been some scary moments. I remember when Charlie Shrem, I think, got arrested and everything. I was like, oh my gosh, is this like a crackdown on all crypto companies? And I remember calling our lawyer and I was like, what do I do if I get arrested? You know, and he's like, well, just give him my phone number and tell him you want to talk to me. So, but that was kind of early days stuff. I mean, there was fears at a certain point that Trump had tweeted about Bitcoin, right? And we went and met with the Treasury and Mnuchin and people like that, and they're actually quite thoughtful about this, and they seem to believe in the the potential for it to create some innovation in the United States and to help companies grow. So they may have many other flaws, but I think so far in our interactions with SEC, CFTC, IRS, et cetera, they seem to believe that this is an area of potential growth for the U.S. economy. And I do try to make it over to DC about once every year or two to kind of build relationships, which is kind of like just one of those things in business, that tends to help for the long term if we want to make sure Bitcoin makes it to the mainstream.
And can you push back on them? Like, are there times where they're pushing at you quite hard and you can push back on them, and do they listen?
It depends on the people, right? I would say there was one meeting I remember having with a congressman where we went through our whole pitch about how this can be, the issues with the traditional financial system and what this can do to improve it and everything. And he kind of said, well, after we're done with Facebook, we're going to come after you. And I was like, okay, that didn't go well. But I would say that's the exception. Most people, even if they come in with sort of a skepticism, they're like, well, this is just used for like money laundering and darknet markets and stuff, right? And we show them the data, and we're like, actually, the best data we have is that about 1% of cryptocurrency transactions are for illicit use. And here's the independent third parties who've done that research. And by the way, cash in the US, it's like 3 to 4% apparently is illicit use. So this is just a tool. It's like the internet or something. It can be used by good people, it can be used by bad people, but most people in the world are good. And so most people are open to those kind of facts when we talk to them about that.
So it's just about educating people then?
Yeah, I think just generally, by the way, there's another thing in human nature, right? Like, which is, I think people are just afraid of new things. I love reading history, right? Like if you go read about the Wright brothers or something, I always assumed that when they demonstrated the first powered flight of an airplane, everybody would have been like, wow, like what's the potential? We can totally use this. Turns out that was not the case. Like for 5 or 6 years, they were trying to get people to even, number one, believe that it was real. Number two, see any kind of potential in it. Like they tried to sell that technology to like the U.S. military and like the U.S. government and everything, and they wrote back and like, we have no interest in flight as a military tool, and so it was kind of amazing. If you study history, a lot of things are underestimated. They look like a toy when they're first created, and eventually they have this enormous potential. But for some reason, most people in the world, they're not oriented to like being excited about new things. They have some kind of a fear about it.